In Trust by Edith Wharton. In the good days, just after we all left college, Ned Halidon and I used to listen, laughing and smoking, while Paul Ambrose set forth his plans. They were immense, these plans involving, as it sometimes seemed, the ultimate ascetic redemption of the whole human race, and provisionally restoring the sense of beauty to those unhappy millions from our fellow countrymen who, as Ambrose movingly pointed out, now live and die in surroundings of unperceived and unmitigated ugliness. I want to bring the poor starved wretches back to their lost inheritance, to the divine past they've thrown away. I want to make 'em hate ugliness so that they'll smash nearly everything in sight," he would passively exclaim, stretching his arms across the shabby black walnut writing table, and shaking his thin consumptive fist in the fact of all the accumulated ugliness in the world. "You might set the example by smashing that table," I once suggested with youthful brutality, and Paul, pulling himself up, cast a surprised glance at me, then looked slowly about the parental library in which we sat. His parents were dead, and he had inherited the house in 17th Street, where his grandfather Ambrose had lived in a setting of black walnut and pier glasses, giving Madeira dinners and saying to his guests, as they rejoined the ladies across the floored waste of a busson carpet, "This, sir, is Dabney's first study for the Niagara. The Grecian slave of the bay window was executed for me in Rome 20 years ago by my old friend Ezra Stimson, by token of which he passed for a Maecenas in the New York of the 40s, and a poem had once published in the Keepsake of the Book of Beauty on a picture of possession of Jonathan Ambrose, Esquire. Since then the house had remained unchanged. Paul's father, a frugal liver and hard-headed manipulator of investments, did not inherit old Jonathan's artistic sensibilities. He was content to live and die in the unmodified black walnut and red rep of his predecessor. It was only in Paul that the grandfather's aesthetic faculty revived, and Mrs. Ambrose used to say to her husband as they watched the little pale-browed boy poring over an old number of the art journal, "Paul will know how to appreciate your father's treasures." In recognition of these transmitted gifts, Paul, on leaving Harvard, was sent to Paris with a tutor, and established in a studio in which nothing was ever done. He could not paint, and recognized the fact early enough to save himself much wasted labor and his friends many painful efforts in dissimulation, but he brought back a touching enthusiasm for the forms of beauty which an old civilization had revealed to him, and an apostolic ardor in the cause of their decimation. He had paused in his harangue to take in my little ill-timed parentheses, and the color mounted slowly to his thin cheekbones. It is an ugly room, he owned, as though he had noticed the library for the first time. The desk was carved at the angles, and the heads of the helmeted knights with long black walnut mustaches. The red cloth top was worn threadbare, and patterned like a map with islands and peninsulas of ink, and in its center throned a massive bronze inkstand representing a Syrian maiden slumbering by a well beneath a palm tree. "The fact is," I said, walking home that evening with Ned Halidon, "old Paul will never do anything, for the simple reason he's too stingy." Ned, who was an idealist, shook his handsome head. "It's not that, my dear fellow. He simply doesn't see things when they're too close to him. I'm glad you woke him up to that desk. The next time I dined with Paul," he said, when we entered the library, and I had gently rejected one of his cheap cigars in favor of a superior article of my own, "Look here, I've been looking round for a decent writing table. I don't care, as a rule, to turn out old things, especially when they've done good service, but I see now that it is too monstrous for an apostle of beauty to write his Evangelon." I agreed. "It is a little inappropriate, except as an awful warning." Paul colored. "Well, but my dear fellow, I'd no idea how much a table of this kind costs. I find I can't get anything decent, the plainest mahogany, under 150. He hung his head, and pretended not to notice I was taking out my own cigar. Well, what's 150 to you? I rejoined. You talk as if you had to live on a bookkeeper's salary with a large family to support. He smiled nervously and twirled the ring on his thin finger. I know, that it's all very well. But for 20 tables that I don't buy, I send some fellow abroad and unseal his eyes. Oh, hang it, do both, I exclaimed impatiently. But the writing table was never brought. The library remained as it was, and so did the contention between Halidon and myself. As to whether this inconsistent acceptance of his surroundings was due, on our friend's part, to the congenial inability to put his hand in his pocket, or to a real unconsciousness of the ugliness that happened to fall inside his point of vision. But he owned that table was ugly, I agreed. Yes, but not till you'd call his attention to the fact, and I'd wager he became unconscious of it again as soon as your back was turned. Not before he'd had time to look at all the others, and make up his mind that he couldn't afford to buy one. That was just his excuse. He'd rather be thought mean than insensible to ugliness. But the truth is, he doesn't mind the table, and he's used to it. He knows his way about the drawers, but he could get another one with the same number of drawers. Too much trouble, argued Halidon. Too much money, I persisted. Oh, hang it now. If we were mean, would we have found 3 traveling scholarships and be planning this big Academy of Arts? Well, he's mean to himself, at any rate. Yes, and magnificently, royally generous to all the world besides, Halidon exclaimed, with one of his great flushes of enthusiasm. But if on the whole the last word remained with Halidon, and Ambrose's personal chariness seemed a trifling foible compared to his altruistic breadth of intention, yet neither of us could help observing, as time went on, that the habit of thrift was beginning to impede his execution of his schemes of art philanthropy. The 3 traveling scholarships had been found in the first blaze of his ardor, and before the personal management of his property had awakened in him the sleeping instincts of parsimony, as if his capital accumulated and problems of investment and considerations of interest began to encroach upon his visionary hours, we saw a gradual arrest in the practical development of his plan. For every $1,000 he talks of spending on his work, I believe he knocks off a cigar, or buys one less newspaper. Halidon grumbled affectionately, but after all, he went on, one of the quick revivals of optimism that gave a perpetual freshness to his spirit. After all, it makes one admire him all the more when one sees such a nature condemned to be at war with the petty inherited instinct of greed. Still, I could see it was a disappointment to Halidon that the great project of the Academy of Arts should languish on paper long after all its details had been discussed and settled to the satisfaction of the projector and the expert advisers he had called in council. He's quite right to do nothing in a hurry, to take advice and compare ideas and points of view, to collect and classify his materials in advance, Halidon argued, in answer to a taunt of mine about Paul's perpetually reiterated plea that he was still waiting for so-and-so's report. But now the plan's mature, and such a plan, you'll grant it's magnificent. I should think he'd burn to see it carried out, instead of pottering over it till his enthusiasm cools and the whole business turns stale in his hands. That summer Ambrose went to Europe, and spent his holiday in a frugal walking tour through Brittany. When he came back, he seemed refreshed by his respite from business cares and from the interminable revision of his cherished scheme, while contact with the concrete manifestations of beauty had, as usual, renewed his flagging ardor. By Jove, he cried, whenever I indulge my unworthy eyes in a long gaze at one of those big things, picture of church or statue, I kept saying to myself, you lucky devil, to provide such a sight as that for eyes that can take some good use of it. Isn't it better to give 50 fellows a chance to paint or carve or build, and to be able to daub canvas or punch clay or a corner by yourself? Well, I said, when he had worked off his first ebullition, when is the foundation stone to be laid? His excitement dropped. The foundation stone? When are you going to touch the electric button that sets the thing going? Paul, with his hands in his sagging pockets, began to pace the library hearthrug. I can see him now, setting his shabby red slippers between his ramified cabbages, My dear fellow, there is one or two to be considered still. One or two new suggestions I picked up over there, and I sat silent, and he paused before me, flushing to the roots of his thin hair. You think I've had enough? That I ought to have put the thing through before this? I suppose you're right. I can see that. Ned Haladon thinks so, and he had always understood my difficulties better than you have. The insinuation exasperated me. Ned would have put it through years ago, I broke out. Paul pulled at his straggling mustache. You mean has more executive capacity? More, no. It's not that. He's not afraid to spend money, and I am, he suddenly exclaimed. He had never before alluded to this weakness to either of us, and I sat abashed, suffering from his evident distress. But he remained planted before me, his little legs wide apart, his eyes fixed on mine, in agony of voluntary exposure. That's my trouble, and I know it. Big sums frighten me. I can't look them in the face. By George, I wish Ned had the carrying out of the scheme. I wish he could spend my money for me. His face was lit by the reflection of a passing thought. Do you know, I shouldn't wonder if I dropped out of the running before either of you chaps. In case I do, I'd have a mind to leave everything in trust to Haladon. Let him put the job through me. Much better to have your own fun with it, I retorted. But he shook his head, saying with a sigh as he turned away, It's not fun to me, that's the worst of it. Haladon, to whom I could not help repeating our talk, was amused and touched by his friend's thought. Heaven knows what will become of the scheme if Paul doesn't live to carry it out. There are a lot of hungry Ambrose cousins who will take one gulp of his money and never give a dollar to the work. Jove, it would be a fine thing to have the carrying out of such a plan, but he'll do it yet. You'll see he'll do it yet, cried Ned, his old friend and his friend flaming up again through the wet blanket of fact. Paul Ambrose did not die and leave his fortune to Haladon, but the following summer he did something far more unexpected. He went abroad again and came back married. Now our busy fancy had never seen Paul married. Even Ned recognized the vague unlikelihood of such a metamorphosis. He'd stick at the parson's fee, not to mention the best man's scarf pin, and I shouldn't hate, Ned added sentimentally, to see the touch of a woman's hand desecrate the sublime ugliness of the ancestral home. Think of such a house made cozy. When the news came, he would neither to surprise nor to disappointment. Goodbye, poor Academy, I exclaimed, tossing over a bridegroom 8-page rhapsody to Haladon, who received its duplicate by the same post. Now why the deuce do you say that? He growled. I never saw such a beast as you are for imputing mean motives. To defend myself from this accusation, I put out my hand and recovered Paul's letter. Here, listen to this. Studying art in Paris when I met her, the vision and the faculty divine, but lacking the accomplishment, etc. A little ethereal profile, like one of the Piero della Francesca's angels, not rich, thank heaven, but not afraid of money, and already enamored by my project for fertilizing my sterile millions. Well, why the deuce? Ned began again, as though I had convicted myself out of my friend's mouth, and I could only grumble obscurely. It's all too pat. He brushed aside my misgivings. Thank heaven he can't paint. Anyhow, and now that I think of it, Paul's just the kind of chap who ought to have a dozen children. Ah, then indeed, goodbye, poor Academy, I croaked. The lady was lovely, of that there could be no doubt, and if Paul now for a time forgot the Academy, his doing so was but a vindication of his sex. Haladon had only a glimpse of the returning couple before he himself snatched up in one of the chariots of adventure that seemed perpetually waiting at his door. This time he was going to the Far East in the train of a special mission, and his head was humming with new hopes and ardors, and he had time for a last word with me about Ambrose. You'll see, he summed up hopefully, as we parted. And what I was to see was, of course, the crowning pinnacle of the Academy lifting itself against the horizon of the immediate future. It was the nature of things that I should, meanwhile, see less informally of the projector that unrealized structure. Paul had a personal dread of society, and he wished to show his wife to the world, and I was not often a spectator to these occasions. Paul, indeed, good fellow, tried to maintain the pretence of unbroken intercourse, and to this end I was asked to dine now and then. But when I found guests of a new type, who, after dinner, talked of sport stocks, while their host blinked at them silently, the smoke of his cheap cigars, the first innovation struck me was a sudden improvement in the quality of the cigars. Was this Daisy's doing? Mrs. Ambrose was Daisy? It was hard to tell. She produced her results so noiselessly. With her fair bent head and vague smile, she seemed to watch life flow by without, as yet trusting anything to her own, to its current. But she was watching, at any rate, and anything might come of that. Such modifications as she produced were as yet imperceptible to any of the trained observer. I saw that Paul wished her to be well dressed, but also that he suffered her to drive to a hired brougham, and to have her door opened by the raw-boned Celt, who had bumped down the dishes on his bachelor table. The drawing-room curtains were renewed, but this change served only to accentuate the enormities of the carpet, and perhaps discouraged Mrs. Ambrose from farther experiments. At any rate, the desecrating touch that Haladon had affected to dread made no other inroads on the serried ugliness of the Ambrose interior. In the early summer, when Ned returned, the Ambrose had flown to Europe again, and the academy was still on paper. "Well, what do you make of her?" the traveler asked, as we sat over our first dinner together. "Too many things, and they don't hang together. Perhaps she's still in the chrysalis stage." "Has Paul chucked the scheme altogether?" "No, he's sent for me, and we had to talk about it just before he sailed." "What impression did you get?" "That he was waited to send for me till just before he sailed." "Oh, there you go again." I offered no denial, and after a pause he asked, "Did she ever talk to you about it?" "Yes, once or twice in snatches." "Well, she thinks it's all too beautiful. She would like to see beauty put within reach of everyone, and the practical side. She says she doesn't understand business." Haladon rose with a shrug. "Very likely you frightened her with your ugly, sardonic grin. It's not my fault if my smile doesn't add to the sum total of beauty." "Well," he said, ignoring me, "next winter we shall see." But the next winter did not bring Ambrose back. A brief line, written in November from the Italian lakes, told me that he had a rotten cough and the doctors were packing him off to Egypt. Would I see the architects for him and explain to the trustees? The academy already had trustees, and all the rest of its official hierarchy. And would they all excuse his not writing more than a word? He was really too groggy, but a little warm weather would set him up again, and he would certainly come home in the spring. He came home in the spring in the hold of the ship, and his widow several decks above. The funeral services were attended by all the officers of the academy, and by two of the young fellows who had won the traveling scholarships, and who shed tears of genuine grief when the benefactor was committed to the grave. After that there was a pause of suspense, and then the newspapers announced that the late Paul Ambrose had left his entire estate to his widow. The board of the academy dissolved like a summer cloud, and the secretary lighted his pipe for a year without the official paper of the stillborn institution. After a decent lapse of time, I called at the house in 17th Street. I found a man attaching a real estate agent's sign to the window, and a van load of luggage backing away from the door. The caretaker told me that Mrs. Ambrose was sailing the next morning. Not long afterward I saw the library table, with the helmeted knight standing before an auctioneer's door in University Place, and I looked with a pang at the familiar ink stains in which I had so often traced the geography of Paul's visionary world. Haladon, who had picked up another job in the Orient, wrote me an elegiac letter on Paul's death, ending with, "And what about the academy?" And for all answer I sent him a newspaper clipping recording the terms of the will, and another announcing the sale of the house and Mrs. Ambrose's departure for Europe. Though Ned and I corresponded with tolerable regularity, I received no direct answer to his communication till about 18 months later, when he surprised me by a letter dated from Florence. It began, "Though she tells me you had never understood her," and when I reached the point I laid it down and stared out my window at the chimney pots and the dirty snow on the roof. Ned Halladone and Paul's wife, I murmured, and incredulous enough, my first thought was, I wish I'd bought the library table that day. The letter went on with waxing eloquence. I could not stand the money if it were not that, to her as well as to me. It represents the sacred opportunity of at last giving speech to his inarticulateness. Oh, damn it, they're too glib, I muttered, dashing the letter down. Then, controlling my unreasoning resentment, I read on. You remember, old man, those words of his that you repeated to me 3 or 4 years ago. I have half a mind to leave my money in trust to Ned. Well, it has come to me in trust, as if in mysterious fulfillment of his thought. And oh, dear chap, I dashed the letter down again and plunged into my work. Won't you own yourself a beast, dear boy? Halladon asked me gently, one afternoon of the following spring. I had escaped for 6 weeks' holiday, and was lying outstretched beside him in a willow chair on the terrace of their villa above Florence, my eyes turned from the happy vale at our feet to the illuminated face beside me. A little way off, the other end of the terrace, Mrs. Halladon was bending over a pot of carnations on the balustrade. Oh, cheerfully I assented. You see, he continued, glowing, living here costs us next to nothing, and it was quite her idea, our founding that 4th scholarship in memory of Paul. I had already heard of the 4th scholarship, but I may have betrayed my surprise at the plural pronoun, for the blood rose under Ned's sensitive skin, and he said with an embarrassed laugh, Ah, she so completely makes me forget that it's not mine too. Well, the great thing is that you both think of it chiefly as his. Oh, chiefly altogether, I should by no more than a wretched parasite if I didn't live first of all for that. Mrs. Halladone had turned, and was advancing toward us with the slow step of leisurely enjoyment. The bud of her beauty had at last unfolded. Her vague, enigmatical gaze had given way to the clear look of a woman whose hand is the clue of life. She's not living for anything but her own happiness, I mused, and why in heaven's name should she? But Ned, my wife, Halladon continued, his eyes following mine. My wife feels it too, even more strongly. You know a woman's sensitiveness. There's nothing she wouldn't do for his memory, because in other ways, you understand, he added, lowering his tone as she drew nearer, that as soon as the child is born, we mean to go home for good, and take up his work, Paul's work. Mrs. Halladon recovered slowly after the birth of her child, and return to America was deferred for 6 months, and then again for a whole year. I heard of the Halladons as established first in Biarritz, then in Rome. The second summer Ned wrote me a line from St. Moritz. He said the place agreed so well with his wife, who was still delicate, and they were thinking of building a house there, a mere cleft in the rocks, to hide our happiness, and when it becomes too exuberant. And the rest of the letter, very properly, was filled with a rhapsody upon his little daughter. He spoke of her as Paula. The following year the Halladons reappeared in New York, and I heard with surprise that they had taken the Breton house for the winter. Well, why not? I argued with myself. After all, the money is hers. As far as I know, the will didn't even hint at a restriction. Why should I expect a pretty woman with 2 children? For now there was an heir, spend her fortune on a visionary scheme that its originator hadn't the heart to carry out. Yes, cried the devil's advocate, but Ned. My first impression of Halladon was that he had thickened all through. He was heavier physically, with the readiness of good living rather than of hard training. He spoke more deliberately, and had less frequent bursts of subversive enthusiasm. Well, he was a father, a householder, yes, and a capitalist now. It was fitting that his manner should show a sense of these responsibilities. As for Mrs. Halladon, it was evident that the only responsibilities she was conscious of were those of the handsome woman and the accomplished hostess. She was handsomer than ever, and her 2 babies at her knee, perfect mother as she was perfect wife. Poor Paul! I wonder if he ever dreamed what a flower was hidden in the folded bud. Not long after their arrival, I dined alone with the Halladons, and lingered on to smoke with Ned, while his wife went alone to the opera. He seemed dull and out of sorts, and complained of a twinge of gout. Fact is, I don't get enough exercise. I must look about for a horse. He had gone afoot for a good many years, and kept his clear skin and quick eye on that homely regimen. But I had to remind myself that, after all, we were both older, and also that the Haladons had champagne every evening. How do you like these cigars? There's some I just got out from London, but I'm not quite satisfied with them myself, he grumbled, pushing toward me with the silver box and its attendant taper. I leaned to the flame, and our eyes met as I lit my cigar. Ned flushed and laughed uneasily. Poor Paul. Were you thinking of those execrable weeds of his? I wonder how I knew you were. Probably because I have been wanting to talk to you of our plan. I sent Daisy off alone so that we might have a quiet evening. Now she isn't interested. Only the technical details bore her. I hesitated. Are there many technical details left to settle? Haladon pushed his armchair back from the firelight and twirled his cigar between his fingers. I didn't suppose there were till I began to look into things a little more closely. You know, I never had much of a head for business, and it was chiefly with you that Paul used to go over the figures. The figures? There it is, you see, he paused. Have you any idea how much this thing is going to cost? Approximately, yes. Have you any idea how much Daisy's fortune amounts to? None whatever, I hastened to assert. He looked relieved. Well, we simply can't do it, and live. Live. Paul didn't live, he said impatiently. I can't ask a woman with 2 children to think of it. Hang it. She's under no actual obligation. He rose and began to walk the floor. Presently, he paused and halted in front of me, defensively, as Paul once done years before. It's not that I've lost my sense of my obligation. It grows keener, and with the growth of my happiness, my position is a delicate one. Oh, my dear fellow, you do see it. I knew you would. He was duller. That's the point. I can't strip my wife and children to carry out a plan so nebulous that even its inventor, the long and short of it, that the whole scheme must be restudied, reorganized. Paul lived in a world of dreams. I rose and tossed my cigar into the fire. There were some things he never dreamed of, I said. Haladon rose too, facing me uneasily. You mean that you would taunt him with not having spent that money? He pulled himself up with darkened brows. Then his muscles of his forehead relaxed and flushed, suffused it, and he held out his hand in boyish penitence. I stand a good deal from you, he said. He kept up his idea of going over the academy question, threshing it out once for all, as he expressed it. My suggestion that we should provisionally resuscitate the extinct board did not meet with his approval. Not till the whole business is settled. I shouldn't have the face. Wait till I can go to them and say, we're laying the foundation stone on such a day. We had 1 or 2 conferences, and Ned speedily lost himself in a maze of figures. His nimble fancy was recalcitrant to mental discipline, and he recused his inattention with the plea that he had no head for business. All I know is that it's a colossal undertaking, and that short of living on bread and water, and then we turned anew to the hard problem of retrenchment. At the close of the 2nd conference, we fixed a date for a 3rd, when Ned's business advisor was to be called in. But before the day came, I learned casually that the Haladons had gone south. Some weeks later, Ned wrote me from Florida, apologizing for his remissness. They rushed off suddenly. His wife had a cough, he explained. When they returned in the spring, I heard they had bought the Brereton house, for what seemed to my inexperienced ears a very large sum. But Ned, whom I met one day at the club, explained to me convincingly it was really the most economical thing they could do. You don't understand about such things, dear boy, living in your Diogenes tub. But wait till there's a Mrs. Diogenes. I can assure you that it's a lot cheaper than building, which is what Daisy would have preferred. And of course, he added, his color rising as our eyes met, of course, once the academy's going, I shall have to make my headquarters here, and I suppose even you won't grudge me a roof over my head. The Brereton roof was a vast one, with a marble balustrade about it, and I could quite understand, without Ned's halting explanation, that under the circumstances it would be necessary to defer what he called our work. Of course, after we've rallied from this amputation, we shall grow fresh supplies. I mean my wife's investments will, he laughingly corrected, and then we'll have no big outlays ahead and shall know exactly where we stand. After all, my dear fellow, charity begins at home. The Haladens floated off to Europe for the summer. In due course, their return was announced in the Social Chronicle, and walking up Fifth Avenue one afternoon, I saw the back of the Brereton house, sheathed in scaffolding, and realized they were adding a wing. I did not look up at Haladan, nor did I hear from him till the middle of the winter. Once or twice, meanwhile, I had seen him in the back of his wife's opera house. Mrs. Haladan had grown so resplendent that she reduced her handsome husband to a supernumerary. In January, the papers began to talk of the Hallaton ball, and in due course I received a card for it. I was not a frequenter of balls, and had no intention of going to this one, but when the day came, some obscure impulse moved me to set aside my rule, and toward midnight I presented myself at Ned's illuminated portals. I shall never forget his look when I accosted him on the threshold of the big new ballroom. With celebrate egoism, I'd rather fancied he would be gratified by my departure from custom, but one glance showed me my mistake. He smiled warmly, indeed, and threw into his hand-clasp an artificial energy of welcome. You of all people, my dear fellow, have you seen Daisy? But the look behind the smile made me feel cold in the crowded room. Nor was Mrs. Haladen's greeting calculated to restore my circulation. Have you come to spy on us? Her frosty smile seemed to say, and I crept home early, wondering if she had not found me out. It was the following week that Haladen turned up one day in my office. He looked pale and thinner, and for the first time I noticed a dash of gray in his hair. I was startled in the change in him, but I reflected that it was nearly a year since we had looked at each other by daylight, and that my shaving glass had doubtless a similar tale to tell. He fidgeted about the office, told me a funny story about his little boy, and then dropped into a chair. Look here, he said, I want to go into business. Business, I stared. Well, why not? I suppose men have gone to work, even at my age, and not made a complete failure of it. The fact is, I want to make some money. He paused and added, I've heard of an opportunity to pick up next to nothing, a site for the academy, if I could lay my hands on a little cash. Do you want to speculate? I interposed. Heaven forbid. But don't you see that? If I had a fixed job, so much a quarter, I could borrow the money and pay it off gradually. I meditated upon this astounding proposition. Do you really think it's wise to buy a site before what? Well, seeing ahead a little. His face fell for a moment, but he rejoined cheerfully, it's an exceptional chance, and after all, I shall see ahead, if I can get regular work. I can put a little every month by and by, when our living expenses diminish. My wife means to come forward. Her idea would be to give the building. He broke off and drummed on the table, waiting nervously for me to speak. He did not say on what grounds he still counted on a diminution of his household expenses, and I had not the cruelty to press this point, but I murmured, after a moment, I think you're right, I should try to buy the land. We discussed his potentialities for work, which were obviously still an unknown quantity, and the conference ended in my sending him to a firm of real estate brokers who were looking out for a partner and a little money to invest. Haladan had a few thousand of his own, which he decided to embark in the venture, and thereafter, for the remaining months of the winter, he appeared punctually at a desk at the broker's office and sketched plans of the academy on the back of his business paper. The site for the future building had meanwhile been bought, and I rather deplored the publicity which Ned gave to the fact that after all, since this publicity served to commit him more deeply to pledge him conspicuously to the completion of his task, it was perhaps a wise instinct of self-coercion that had prompted him. It was a dull winter in reality, and toward spring, when the market began to revive, one of the Haladan children showed symptoms of a delicate throat, and the fashionable doctor, who humored the family ailments, counseled, nay, commanded a prompt flight to the Mediterranean. He says a New York spring would be simply criminal. As for those ghastly southern places, my wife won't hear of them, so rough. but I shall be back in July. I mean to stick to the office all summer." He was true to his word, and he reappeared just as all his friends were deserting town. For 2 torrid months he sat at his desk, drawing fresh plans for the academy, and waiting for the windfall of a big deal. But in September he broke down from the effect of the unwanted confinement, and his indignant wife swept him off to the mountains. "Why, Ned should work when we have the money. I wish he would sell that wretched piece of land, and sell it one day. Sell it he did one day. I chanced on the record, the transaction in the reality column in the morning paper. He afterward explained the sale to me at length. Owing to some spasmodic effort at municipal improvement, where had been an unforeseen rise in the adjoining property, and it would have been foolish, yes, I agreed, that it would have been foolish, he had made $10,000 on the sale, and would go towards paying off what he had borrowed for the original purchase. Meanwhile, he could be looking about for another site. Later in the winter, he told me it was a bad time to look. His position in the real estate business enabled him to follow the trend for the market, and that trend was obstinately upward, and of course there would be a reaction, and he was keeping his eyes open. As the resuscitated academy scheme once fell into an abeyance, I saw Hallidan less and less frequently, and we had not met for several months, when one day in June my morning paper startled me with the announcement that the President had appointed Edward Hallidan of New York to be Civil Commissioner of Earth's newly acquired eastern possession, the Manana Islands. The healthy climate of the islands and the defective sanitation of the towns made it necessary that the vigorous measures should be taken to protect the health of the American citizens established there, and it is believed that Mr. Hallidan's large experience of Eastern life and well-known energy of his character. I read the paragraph twice, and then I dropped the paper, and projected myself through the subway to Hallidan's office. But he was not there. He had not been there for a month. One of the clerks believed he was in Washington. "It's true then," I said to myself, "but Mrs. Hallidan is in the Mananas." A day or two later, Ned appeared in my office. He looked better than when we had last met, and there was a determined line about his lips. "My wife, heaven forbid. You don't suppose I should think of taking her, but the job is a tremendously interesting one, and it's the kind of work I believe I can do. The only kind," he added, smiling rather ruefully. "But my dear Ned," he faced me with a look of quiet resolution, "I think I've been through all the buts. It's an infernal climate, of course, but then I am used to the East. I know the precautions to take, and it would be a big thing to clean up that Augean stable. But consider your wife and children." He met this with deliberation. "I've considered my children. That's the point. I don't want them to be able to say when they look back, 'He was content to go on living on that money.' My dear Ned, that's the one thing they shan't say of me," he pressed on vehemently. "I've tried other ways, but I'm no good at business. I see now that I shall never make money enough to carry out the scheme myself, but at least I can clear out, and not go on being his pensioner, seeing his dreams turned into horses and carpets and clothes." He broke off, and leaning on my desk and his face in my hands, when he looked up again his flush of wrath had subsided. "Just understand me. It's not her fault. Don't fancy I'm trying for an instant to shift the blame. A woman with children simply obeys the instinct of her sex. He puts them first, and I wouldn't have it otherwise. As far as she's concerned, there was no conditions attached. There's no reason why she should make any sacrifice." He paused and added painfully, "The trouble is, I can't make her see that I am differently situated. But Ned, the climate, what are you going to gain by chucking yourself away?" He lifted his brows. "That's a queer argument from you. And besides, I'm up to the tricks of all those argue-holes, and I've got to live, you see. I've got something to put through." He saw my look of enquiry, and added with a shy, poignant laugh, "How I hear still. I don't mean the only job in hand, though that's enough in itself, but Paul's work, you understand. It won't come in my day, of course. I've got to accept that. But my boy's a splendid chap. The boy was 3, and I tell you what it is, old man, I believe when he grows up, he'll put it through. Haladon went to the Mananas, and for 2 years the journalist brought me incidental reports of the work he was accomplishing. He certainly had found a job to his hand. Official words of commendation rang through the country, and there were lengthy newspaper leaders of the efficiency with which our representative was prosecuting his task in that lost corner of our colonies. Then one day a brief paragraph announced his death. One of the last victims of the pestilence he had so successfully combated. That evening at my club, I heard men talking of him. One said, "What's the use of a fellow wasting himself on a lot of savages?" Another wiseacre opined, "Oh, he went off because there was friction at home. A fellow like that, who knew the East, would have got through all right if he had taken the proper precautions. I saw him before he left, and I never saw a man look less as if he wanted to live." I turned on the last speaker, and my voice made him drop his lighted cigar on the complacent knuckles. "I never knew a man," I exclaimed, "who had better reasons for wanting to live." A handsome youth mused, "Yes, his wife is very beautiful, but it doesn't follow." Then someone nudged him, and they knew I was Haladon's friend. And that's the end of In Trust by Edith Wharton. I thought that was a good story. It was a story about business and making money and employment, and it just talks about how difficult it is to find work sometimes, and sometimes you think you're all alone in not being able to find a decent job, but people drive themselves into the ground every day working bad jobs and working jobs they can't do and working jobs that are bad for their health. Like, this guy's going off to some third world country where there's like a disease going around, trying to make the disease go away, but he gets the disease and he dies. You can drive. The lesson of the story is you can drive yourself into the ground if you work too hard. If you're doing the wrong jobs, if you make business your whole life and you make everything about working and you focus on things that aren't realistic, you focus on things that aren't possible, you will drive yourself in the ground. That's why a lot of guys don't live as long as women do, because men feel like this pressure to be like financially successful, and I know women feel it too, but a lot of people, the work destroys them. Like, work can destroy someone, and you can't be obsessed with work, and you can't work bad jobs. Like, I've worked bad jobs before, and I just quit. I've quit, and to this very day, I remind myself I will not apply to those bad jobs again. I have no interest in working a bad job. There's no reason engaging in some sort of enterprise that's going to destroy me. There's no reason working somewhere where I'm going to fail and it's going to destroy my body. I don't want to be a janitor if it's going to destroy my back. I don't want to work customer service if it's going to destroy my psyche. I don't want to work jobs that I can't do. And I agree with this guy. I mean, I agree with the lesson of the story 100%. Sometimes you just got to understand the cards you've been given and just say, look, this is who I am. This is what I'm doing. And don't obsess over being, the big man on campus and trying to be so impressive with how much money you make and all this stuff. And it's not all about how much money you make. It's not all about how financially successful you are. A lot of life is just doing the bare minimum to get by. It's just, accept mediocrity. So many people I see are afraid of accepting mediocrity. It's strange. So I see so many people just so afraid of accepting mediocrity. I don't get it. I don't get why more people aren't comfortable with mediocrity. Everyone wants to be a big business star. Everybody wants to be Donald Trump. Everyone wants to be Mark Cuban. Wants to be a big business star. You know what? Sometimes mediocrity's better than anything. Go sit down. Go meditate. Go do something simple. Do a job you can do. Do a job that's reasonable, doesn't ask too much for you. Do reasonable jobs. Just meditate the rest of the day. There's no reason to do a job you can't do. There's no reason to put yourself through the impossible. Should you try to find better opportunities for employment? Yes, you should try to find better opportunities for employment. But you shouldn't destroy yourself to find those opportunities. You shouldn't do jobs you know you can't do. If you think the people aren't going to like you there, then don't work there. You don't want to work with people who don't like you. If you think there's bad things at that job, then don't work there. You don't have to work anywhere you don't want to. Just be homeless. Just live as a, what do you call it? There's a Buddhist word for this. There's a aesthetic. Live as an aesthetic. If you're not good enough to make money, live as an aesthetic. Become homeless. People survive every day homeless. Is it harder to survive as homeless? Yeah, it is harder to survive as homeless. Is it impossible? No, it's not impossible. You'll find a way. You'll find a way to survive. And it's important to keep in mind that if a job is going to destroy you, don't do it. There's always better options than picking a job that will destroy you. Find a way to get through life. Find a way that you live that maximizes your life expectancy. Do a part-time job instead of a full-time job. If you make less money, ask money from somebody else. Ask money from your parents or whatever. Ask money from somebody with more money. Well, you just find out how to survive. Survival it doesn't have to ruin you. It doesn't have to destroy you if you let it. That's my thought. I like that story, And Trust by Edith Wharton. I like that. So the guy's obsessed with business, and he lets it destroy him because he works so hard. You can't worry that much about it. It's not that big of a deal. It's not that big of a deal, and you can't let your business destroy you. I really like that story. I thought that was fantastic, and that's exactly why I read Edith Wharton, because she writes really good stories like this. 2 thumbs up, really good. Let me know in the comments below, what did you think of the story? I really liked it. Let me know in the comments below what you thought. Please subscribe to be part of the community, and please like this video. It really helps the channel out a lot. Thank you for watching. Have a great day. Bye-bye.